Julie Jensen, a woman who had this magnetic charm that made everyone around her just love her. Her family, especially her brothers, were totally devoted to her. And Julie, all she always wanted was to have a family of her own and become a mom. She had this idealized idea of what life should be, and at first everything seemed in line with that idea while she was with Mark, her first serious boyfriend. They had a joyful marriage full of love. But things started to unravel when Julie admitted to having an affair. She was clearly filled with guilt, but Mark had already sensed something was off. Julie had seemed down, unhappy, and distant for a while. Eventually, Julie decided to end their relationship, wanting a fresh start with kids but without Mark in her life. Then on December 3, 1998, things took a tragic turn. A healthy 40-year-old Julie was suddenly found dead on that day. And at first it looked like it could be a natural cause, but then they found this letter she wrote a couple of weeks before her death, on November 21, 1998. This letter was shocking, and in it she poured out her guilt about the affair, and some people even thought the letter could be her way of saying goodbye, almost like a last will. Mark was completely blindsided when he read the letter. He couldn't make sense of it at all, and soon the cops started asking questions, wondering if Julie actually took her own life, or if someone was trying to set Mark up for something much worse. Or was it Mark himself who did all these? Whatever it was, what could be the motive? Only affair or something else? You see, there are tons of questions. But answers we need to investigate. Julie had been living in Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin, a quiet little town that got eerily cold and still in the winter, much different from the busy, lively summers. Plus, Julie's sudden death left everyone around her in shock, especially her brothers, Paul and Patrick. They had no idea she was dealing with anything serious health-wise. Mark, utterly shaken, brought up the fact that Julie had been taking some medications like Ambien and Paxil, and he wondered if there was some kind of dangerous drug interaction involved. But even that didn't clear up the mystery. Julie's in-laws, Florence and Dan Jensen, were also really worried about Mark. They said he was completely distraught, not able to explain things properly. Mark and Julie had been together for 20 years, ever since high school. So this was a huge blow for him. Julie, meanwhile, had always struggled with depression. She had even dropped out of nursing school because her deep emotional connection with her patients was too much for her to handle. But it was her mother's history with alcoholism and depression that seemed to weigh heavily on her. Julie had always feared she'd end up just like her mom, and her battles with her own mental health only seemed to confirm that fear. And things were starting to look a lot darker than anyone had anticipated. It wasn't easy for her family to understand just how bad things were. After having their first son, David, in 1991, things got rocky in her marriage. Julie admitted to having an affair, and although she filed for divorce, the couple went to counseling and eventually worked things out. Surprisingly, by 1995, they had another son, Douglas. But by the fall of 1998, their marriage was falling apart again. Julie's husband, Mark, told his friends that he was overwhelmed by Julie's depression. Julie reached out to her family doctor, who prescribed her an antidepressant. But just 2 days later, she was found dead under extremely mysterious circumstances. If you think autopsy would reveal some hidden clue, it also didn't reveal any injuries, and no clear cause of death could be determined. Rather, there were only whispers that Julie's emotional struggles might have led her to take her own life. But she had never mentioned about self-harm, and she didn't leave a note. Only she did leave a letter for her family telling them how much she loved them. Before her death, Julie had opened up to a few people about her fears. She had a strange conversation with her son's teacher, Teresa DeFazio, where she said, "I think my husband's going to kill me." She also shared similar worries with the Voigt family, their neighbors. These talks, combined with some unsettling changes in Mark's behavior, had people questioning the state of their marriage. Mark had started calling Julie a bad mom and blaming her for the bad influence she had on their kids. Things only got more concerning in the months before Julie's death. She noticed Mark was looking up poisons online and writing odd notes. She even took photos of the notes, which included lists of drugs and syringes, things she feared he might use to hurt her. Despite her growing suspicions, Julie wasn't entirely sure what was going on. By early November, her health was getting worse, and that's when Margaret and Ted Voigt started worrying. That's when Julie confided in them, saying she thought her husband was trying to kill her. She even told them Mark had suggested she take the kids and leave, offering her money to go. But Julie was too scared. She feared Mark would track her down, make her look crazy, and keep her away from her children. Ted even suggested she go to a women's shelter, but Julie refused. Then, on November 21st, Julie gave Ted a letter, telling him to give it to the police if anything happened to her. Ted didn't read it. The last time Margaret spoke to Julie was on December 2nd. Julie mentioned she wasn't feeling well but said Mark was treating her fine. Her voice sounded shaky, but that was the last conversation Margaret had with her. And just over a day later, Julie was found dead. The letter was handed over to the authorities, but its contents only raised more questions about what had really happened. The letter stated like this: "I took this picture and I'm writing this on Saturday, November." Julie's letter referred to the photo she took of a list. The same list she had mentioned to Teresa DeFazio. "This list was in my husband's business daily planner, not meant for me to see. I don't know what it means, but if anything happens to me, he would be my first suspect. I pray I am wrong and nothing happens, but I am suspicious of Mark's suspicious behaviors and fear for my early demise." Now, District Attorney Bob Jambois started getting a really bad feeling when experts dug into the Jensen family's home computer. They found out that someone had been trying to wipe its history clean. But no matter how hard they tried to erase things, they still found something. And it was pretty shocking. There were emails between Mark Jensen and a mysterious woman he'd met at his new job. Her name was Kelly Labonte. These emails were full of romantic stuff like IDL, which, by the way, stands for I do love you and I miss you, I want you. It was clear Mark was also having an affair. The investigation also uncovered something even more disturbing. Mark had been searching online for ways to kill his wife, including looking into poisons like ethylene glycol. Yes, that's the main ingredient in antifreeze, and it's not hard to get your hands on it. Even worse, it doesn't take much of it to kill someone. Dr. Mary Mainland, an expert in post-mortem studies, said that as little as 50 milliliters could be enough to cause death. And guess what? Julie Jensen had shown symptoms that looked like poisoning right before she died. She seemed drunk for no reason. But when they did the first toxicology tests, they couldn't find any ethylene glycol in her system. Still, the investigation kept going, and they came across another letter which was addressed from Julie to Mark. In this letter, she accused him of being the reason she was dying. At first, Mark denied it, but then he said something odd, like maybe something had to be done for her to die. Now it was starting to look like a premeditated plan. Also, some thought Julie might have written the letter to frame him. But 2 years later, after a bunch of lab tests, they finally found traces of ethylene glycol in Julie's stomach. It was clear now she had been poisoned. Both DA Bob Jambois and Assistant DA Angie Gabrielle were convinced that Julie didn't took her life. Rather, Mark Jensen had intentionally killed his wife. So in March 2002, Mark was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The whole case centered around the idea that Julie had been poisoned, likely with ethylene glycol. Mark kept saying he was innocent and that Julie's death was just an accident. He and his parents claimed that Julie, being a nurse, knew a lot about drugs and poisons, and that she had somehow poisoned herself on purpose to set Mark up. They even argued that Julie had planned the whole thing, including writing the letter to her neighbor to make Mark look guilty. But the letter itself raised a lot of questions. It had a weird tone, almost like it was written as a story, and Mark's defense team tried to get it thrown out of court. They said it wasn't fair because they couldn't cross-examine Julie since she was dead. The judge agreed at first and threw the letter out. But after a long legal battle, the Wisconsin Supreme Court decided the letter could be used in court, as long as there was enough evidence to show that Mark was involved. So the trial became a tug-of-war over what that letter really meant. Julie's brothers said it was super important because it showed what Julie was thinking. But the defense brought in a forensic pathologist who said the letter was a load of nonsense. In the end, the whole case came down to whether there was enough circumstantial evidence to prove Mark was behind his wife's death. Fast forward to 9 years since Julie Jensen's tragic death, Mark Jensen, who was out on bail and now married to his lover, Kelly Labonte, seemed pretty confident heading into his trial. But things took a surprising twist when a witness named Ed Klug was suddenly called to the stand. Klug, who used to work with Mark, dropped a bombshell. About 3 weeks before Julie's death, Mark had told him he was planning to kill her. Apparently, Mark had been looking up poisons that wouldn't show up in a standard autopsy, and had even been exploring websites on how to kill people. Klug said this all went down while they were at a company convention in St. Louis, where they'd been drinking. During their chat, Mark supposedly went into detail about how he'd make Julie's death look like either a self-harm or just a result of her supposed health problems. But despite hearing all this, Klug didn't go to the police. When asked why, he admitted he was too focused on his own business issues at the time and, even though he knew it was serious, he was scared to get involved in a murder investigation. Klug's testimony didn't sit well with everyone. Some people questioned how reliable his story was since they had been drinking, and the prosecutor didn't hold back in criticizing Klug for not doing the right thing sooner. He pointed out that Klug only came forward after one of his co-workers had tipped off the prosecutor's office. Mark, of course, denied the whole thing. He said Klug's version of events couldn't be trusted because of the drinking, but the judge wasn't convinced. In fact, the judge decided to raise Mark's bond to over $1 million, saying the original amount was too low. If Mark couldn't post the new bond, he'd stay behind bars until his trial. So Mark was taken into custody. Julie's brothers were devastated by it all, especially as they thought about the what-ifs surrounding her last days. They couldn't help but wonder if a simple thing like inviting her to lunch or just dropping by her house might have changed the outcome. They were heartbroken, thinking about how desperate she must have felt when she wrote her final letter. The defense in this case claims that Julie Jensen just took her own life, that she did it to punish her husband Mark for cheating on her. The whole thing hinges on this letter Julie wrote, which the judge decided was fair game as evidence. Then during the trial, a special prosecutor named Bob Jambois dropped a huge bombshell. He said that Julie didn't just die from poisoning with ethylene glycol like everyone thought. He claimed she was also suffocated. He suggested that after Mark had poisoned her, he went the extra step and smothered her with a pillow while she was already in a weakened state. Fast forward 9 years after Julie's death, and a guy named Aaron Dillard stepped up with some big news. He's a jailhouse informant with a shady past. He's been convicted of fraud multiple times. So the defense didn't exactly trust him. They said he was a liar with an agenda trying to get out of jail. Aaron admitted he's lied in the past, but insisted his testimony is legit. He said he had pieced the story together from things he learned from other people. Despite his reputation, Aaron's story hits hard, especially with Julie's brothers in the room. They listened, visibly shaken, as Aaron described in disturbing detail how Mark allegedly smothered Julie. He told everyone that Mark confessed to him about the whole thing. Apparently, Mark first tried to poison Julie with antifreeze, but when she started breathing better, he freaked out. He was worried that the kids would take her to the hospital, so he decided to smother her instead, by sitting on her back and pressing her face into a pillow. This is the same position Julie's face was in when her body was found, which made sense now because it looks like someone put her there on purpose after she was already dead. So now the trial wasn't just about the poisoning, it's about suffocation too. Things get even crazier when the Kenosha County Medical Examiner does something wild in court. He tasted a bit of ethylene glycol to show the jury why Julie might not have realized she was drinking poison. He described the taste as sweet, which helps back up the idea that Julie didn't know what she was drinking until it was too late. The defense, of course, calls it all made up. To top it all off, the prosecution brings in Kelly Jensen, Mark's former mistress, to add more fuel to the fire. Now things are getting really complicated, so the whole thing with Julie Jensen's death has been dragging on for years now. With this big back and forth in the courts, the defense argues that her husband, Mark Jensen, didn't kill her. They say that the affair he had wasn't a motive for murder, but rather the reason why Julie ended up taking her own life. The defense is claiming that Julie drank antifreeze, ethylene glycol, in an attempt to kill herself. But then they say she tried to blame Mark for poisoning her. A psychiatrist who testified for the defense said Julie was struggling with depression and was prone to self-harm, which they say played a big role in her decision to drink the poison. Plus, her personal doctor also backed this up, saying she'd been acting pretty distraught and frantic in the days leading up to her death. All of this seemed to point to the idea that Julie's death wasn't murder. But then things took a twist when Julie's brother, Patrick, was called to testify. He wasn't exactly eager to talk about it, but he admitted that when he was 16, he'd tried to take his own life by cutting his wrist, all because he was angry with their dad. Patrick said it was serious and that he truly meant to end his life. This little bit of info got the jury thinking, especially since they could start drawing comparisons between Patrick's struggles and what Julie might have been going through. Then the special prosecutor, Bob Jambois, wrapped things up by reading Julie's letter to the jury. He argued that the letter was her way of exposing the truth. Jambois believed that Julie wasn't trying to take her life but was actually poisoned, and that her death was a murder attempt that was made to look like a suicide. According to him, Julie wanted people to know the truth, and that letter was her final shot at making sure that happened. In the end, Mark was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was completely crushed. He really thought the jury would clear his name, but they didn't. Julie's letter, which mentioned a list found in Mark's daily planner, seemed to give a big clue. It was almost like she was responding to things on that list, which made it pretty clear her death wasn't something she chose for herself. When it came to sentencing, Julie's family asked for the maximum punishment for Mark. But then their son David, who was 18 by this point, read a letter in court. He talked about how he still believed his dad was a good man and asked the judge for parole for him. Even with David's words, Mark was sentenced to life in prison without the chance for parole. The judge really drove home how brutal the crime was. Julie's family, especially her brother Patrick, focused on healing and remembering Julie for who she was, a wonderful mom and a genuine person. But what's your take on this case? Do you think Mark really killed Julie? Or is it her who took her own life? If she knew all these could happen, why did she just write a story-like letter instead of making some efforts to protect herself? Share your thoughts in the comment section. In this case, you just heard of a letter that solved the case, but have you ever heard of the beauty so charming that could kill, so people named it Lethal Beauty? If not, watch this next true crime case that happened decades ago and became the first trial of the century ever. Subscribe to the channel for more content like this. See you soon.